speaker in part two is another one of our contributors from the book. First of all, I'm getting to meet Allison Zionts in person, if we call this in person. And please tell me if I've pronounced your last name wrong there, Allison. It's lovely to see you. And I think you're going to build on what Lisa said with this idea of how you bring yourself to the classroom and use yourself as a living resource. So I'm really excited to hear you speak.
Hi, good morning. I'm very excited to be here. You did pronounce my last name correctly, and I am very excited to be following from Lisa and building on to being that resource in the classroom. So I'm just going to share my slides really quickly. Thank you. Um, so I'm speaking about becoming this living resource for the classroom, and the first thing I want to do is that positionality, and who am I really when we're looking into this. Like many people here, I'm a teacher. I'm also a student. I'm a PhD student. I'm an immigrant, and I'm quite proudly an immigrant of someone who's moved to this country, of generations of family who have had to move and bounce around. I'm a Jewish woman, which is what I'm going to be speaking about mostly today. I'm part of the queer community. I'm a vegan. I'm a volunteer, and I'm also at many points in time a resource. I also quite like this picture was chosen by my students yesterday because they said nothing captures me more than what looks like me just hanging out in a library looking like a geeky teacher. So I thought I would share that one. I'm speaking about today, I have two images on the screen because when I started working in British schools, I would occasionally drop into my lessons that small bits about myself, including the fact that I was Jewish. It would also and often be followed up with curious minds, and occasionally I would have to correct some misconceptions they had around people who are Jewish. And sometimes these misconceptions were really innocent, and sometimes they were full blown anti Semitic conspiracy theories that they had parroted from either an online source or, in some cases, what they had heard from families or even previous schools. These were from students that I taught personally, who I felt very comfortable with, and our conversations were always supportive and always fruitful, and I never regretted having a single one. I have two images on the screen right now, one representing Holocaust Memorial Day, and another a painting portraying a scene from Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, which is going to be quite a theme today. Outside of religious education lessons, these tend to be the only times that Jews are really brought up within the national curriculum or the standard school year. As the only Jewish teacher in most of the schools I've taught in, and in most cases the only Jewish person, this means that I become someone that students I don't even teach start to talk about or whisper about. Suddenly, the simple fact that I'm Jewish falls into one of two categories. Either I come from a line of victims, as we see with Holocaust Memorial Day, or I could come from a line of villains, as might be portrayed in their English lessons. Young people will then struggle to separate me from these two categories. And it's really about what we can do to help build that in to make sure they understand that diversity within. So within academic writing, what I do is often referred to as being this authentic resource. It's not just about being yourself, because as we know, teachers have to be that professional space within their classroom, remaining apolitical. But it's around how teachers can model who they are and being open enough about their personal characteristics and how they might incorporate these characteristics into their lessons. There's no one way to do this, there's no roadmap. And it's really about the boundaries that teachers feel comfortable setting for themselves, as well as making sure that they are supported within the schools. One thing I really want to bring up is that staff can't be forced at any point to sharing their identities or sharing their stories with students. For a number of reasons, they may not feel safe doing so. It may not fit their style of teaching, their own pedagogy, but it's around creating this culture where it's acceptable to do that, where staff and students can authentically be themselves, share who they are, and that the school can invest within this as a way of enriching education and enriching cultural capital. We live within contemporary British society. Students are surrounded by millions of people who are both similar to them and dissimilar to them. And being authentic is just one way that we can allow students to explore these characteristics in our society within a controlled and safer space. Doing this, though, we do need to keep in mind that it needs to be embedded, it needs to be part of the school culture. and that we also need to make sure we put in safeguards in place for the students who will want to explore and get involved and show who they are, and they need to be supported as well. Um, Around 6 years ago, one of the deputy head teachers at my school and I were talking about the Merchant of Venice, and she knew that I had really strong feelings about exposure of Jews within the national curriculum. And she asked if I would come in just for a quick 5 minutes to do a Q&A with her year nines and give them some context around Jewish life, and I wholeheartedly agreed. Those 5 minutes led to a full hour. The students were incredibly engaged and they had so many questions, and they were grateful that I was giving them space to ask these questions. I made a really strong rule at the beginning about the fact that they can ask a question and I will assume it comes from a place of good intent. So if they're asking something that could come across as hurtful, I'll explain to them why it comes across as hurtful, but then answer their question. And I didn't want them to feel like they couldn't ask a question, maybe their only time being able to ask a question to someone they knew of as Jewish, with them feeling stopped in that situation. Since that point, I've been invited to share and speak in every Year 9 English class within the summer term as they read this text. So over the last 6 years, I have spoken to 50 classes of Year 9 students within my school. And it's a way of providing them with context, but also providing them with another face, another experience of what a Jewish person could look like or what a Jewish person has gone through. It's broadened their understanding of Jews, but also made many students from other marginalized backgrounds start to feel comfortable picking holes within the curriculum. Start to say, actually, we talk about people from my country in this book, but actually, that's not been my experience. Can I share my experience? Can I enrich the lives of my students? Because they start to see themselves as that resource. It makes our classrooms and our schools much richer places, and it's one where our students can become to feel more prepared and more empowered to be who they really are. For the last year, and I know Benny is going to be quite pleased having this on the screen, our schools incorporated reading Benny's book on diversity in schools as part of our CPD. And as we read this, it's not just everybody read a chapter, all right, have 5 minutes to discuss, now let's move on. It's really talking about how do we embed this. From reading this book and from some of our experiences, staff have started sharing their experiences in front of whole staff meetings. So we've had colleagues stand up to speak about what it was like growing up as a Black Muslim student in a predominantly white non-Muslim area. We've had staff stand up and say, as a parent of a disabled child, here are things I experienced that I would like staff to know about. I was able to stand up and speak about anti-Semitism that I experienced in my own life and giving some of that context. And it allows staff to start to again recognize that diversity. But you cannot do this. And as we're thinking about goals today, I really don't want people to say, next week in staff meeting, I'm going to ask if anybody has something to share. It cannot happen without that strong foundation that these stories are going to be held, are going to be listened to, and they're not going to be tokenistic. So I ask you if we're setting some goals to dedicate some time, some really valuable time to breaking down what we can do to allow those staff and students to be themselves, to share their experiences, and to make sure those experiences never feel like a tick box, never feel like something we're just going to listen to, say, thank you, and move on from. How can they become more than distant memories or something in the ether? But how can we use this to build into our curriculum time to explore and engage with the real people living in our community and working in our schools? Thank you very much for listening to me. I think I spoke a little bit quickly, but I get very scared of running out of time.
Yeah, it was absolutely fascinating. And of course, yes, I recognized the book on the screen. So thank you for that. It's really interesting hearing you talk about yourself as a living resource. And I think it's wonderful for the children to be able to see that. My question comes from a point of kind of the mental workload of that. So, being the representative for an entire, religion of people, is that not wearying?
It absolutely can be, and I'm really glad you mentioned that. And that's why I think it actually needs to be built in. So I have regular line manager meetings, obviously with my line manager, and in that we do talk about when things come up, and I'm able to go and share with her and say, I'm having these conversations. Here's what I'm going to do to give myself time. So if I'm speaking to a year 9 class, I'm not going to go straight from there to my year 10 class. What can I do to build in a little bit of comfort time for me?
Mm,
And my school's really good at making sure that feels supported. If something comes up that actually is a little bit difficult or triggering, part of that being a living resource and being that authentic is saying to students and saying to staff,
mm,
now's not the time I'm able to talk about this. And it also models that boundary setting for them.
mm.
And I want students and staff themselves to not feel like just because somebody asks you, you have to give them an answer on the spot. You can say, now's not the time. I'm happy to talk about this after school.
Mm, mm.
I'm happy to talk about this another day. Or actually, sometimes now's not the time, but here's somebody else I can recommend for you that's an online resource. And let's talk about it
Mm.
once you have a bit more groundwork.
Yeah.
And it's setting those boundaries and just being really confident. If I was having a really bad day, I would probably not do one of those talks to year 9s and say, I'd
Yeah.
actually rather, for my own well-being, move it to next Tuesday if we can. And staff are
So
really good around that.
I think that's very wise. I think kind of protecting ourselves, because there is an inherent vulnerability to being a living resource. What conditions had to be there in order for you to feel safe in the space, at school, to be able to be this living resource?
I think the safety came from knowing when I was asked to speak. So when I was asked to speak about Merchant of Venice the first time, I was
Mm,
asked by someone who knew this was something I was passionate about and that I'd be comfortable doing. It was something very much a opt-in, not expected of.
yeah.
And I think if we're again setting these goals, it's if you have marginalized staff who might be willing to speak, make sure they know this isn't something they're being forced to do.
Mm,
This
mm,
is something that um, they need to know going into this. Here's what
mm.
we're going to do. Here's how we're going to protect you. And not only that, here's how what you say is going to have an impact.
Yeah.
Tell them the value of this, because otherwise it's, please give us your emotional labor for nothing. Give us
Yeah.
your emotional labor, and here's how we're going to support you through that. And here's how your emotional labor and time is going to positively impact the students and those around you.
Yeah. And
And
it's
teachers
massively
have that moral background that I think many would
I
do.
think I hear that, and when you talk about those conditions, I think safety is such a big consideration, because we know that anti-Semitism is still rife. We know that people will come with very insidious views, and quite often children will have misconceptions that you're going to face in any kind of question and an answer session. Now, just kind of flipping this slightly, there will be schools where there are no Jewish teachers, and so apart from shipping you to different parts of the country, what can be done? Can you do this work? Can you be the living resource when you don't have the identity?
I think that's a lot more difficult. I think religious studies departments tend to do it very well. So when we think about that authentic living or authentic
Mm,
experiences, you might have a religious studies department in some schools of 1 or 2 people who have to now represent 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 religions, and they bring in their authentic resources by field trips,
mm,
by bringing in artifacts and materials, and by having those around them and saying, I don't know all the answers. I can't tell you what it's like to live with this resource,
mm,
but let's go to a place where people do, or let's listen to as many actual voices of people with these experiences as possible. And
yeah.
I think if people are struggling for how they can incorporate this, talk to your RE departments
Mm.
because they find ways to do this.
Absolutely. I still think we should just ship you to different parts of the country, and
I'd love that. That would be fun.
like we've got Allison. But no, thank you so much for sharing your experiences
Absolutely.
today. I'm so amazed by the work that you do, and I'm sure that the students are getting such a good deal out of it. So thank you, and please do stay in touch. It's so nice to meet you in
Absolutely.
person.
It's very exciting. Thank you very much for having
Take
me.
care.